The shape facing operator is designed to produce simple square polygon shapes that have mapping coordinates applied to them. You can then give these shapes a target and they will always face towards it. This is useful when you want to use some kind of sprite type mapping on your particles and you wish them to face your camera. Let's have a look at the options. Actually, before we do that, let's have a quick look at what I've actually got set up in this scene. You can see I have a source gizmo here. Here's the particle flow source, and you can see I've set it to be a box shape. Now, what's actually happening is particles are being emitted during the entire duration of this simulation, and that's just so I can actually show you something a little bit later. So you can see particles are emitted from frame 0 to frame 150, and you can see they're actually moving upwards on the z-axis. Now, if I go to the material editor, and I'll show you the material that I've actually got applied to these particles, I've actually got them mapped using, you can see in the diffuse color of this material, I have a IFL file which actually points to a series of bitmaps, and you can see here's one of the frames from this sequence. This is actually a sequence which will be covered in one of our future DVDs. It actually demonstrates using a script to control lights, to actually get lights and then bind them to particles, so you can have your particles emitting light in your scene. For now, I'm just using it as an example of an animated sequence which is actually being used on the facing shapes. So if I turn on material mapping, you can see the particles get mapped with that texture, although it doesn't actually update over time, so they're all showing the same image. But because they're all being emitted at a different time, the actual animation which is actually applied to these this texture gets offset per particle. So if I do a quick render of this, you can actually see they've all got different frames from the particular animation on them. To highlight the actual orientation of these particles, which is actually a very important part of the facing shape operator, I'm just going to turn off texturing for now, because you can actually then see the highlights on each one of these particles, and it gives you a better idea of the orientation of them. You can see that at the moment they're all pointing towards this camera here. Okay, so that's the setup in the scene, so let's have a quick look at the options as I said earlier. Okay, the first thing to notice is that we have a button here called the Look at Camera Object button, and you can see we've actually got it set up already to point at a camera, and this actually is this camera here. Now, in previous particle systems in 3D Studio Max, this sort of system, you didn't have to set it up manually. You basically told the particles to face towards a camera, and they would actually face towards whichever camera was active during the render. In particle flow, this is actually handled differently, and it adds another level of flexibility to particle flow, but also means that you actually lose the ability for the particles to face the currently active camera in a renderer. So, as an example, if you set up a scene using, let's say, video post, I mean, not many people use it these days, but as an example, if you set up a scene using video post which rendered from, say, 6 different cameras in sequence, camera 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, with the previous particle system, as it changed between the cameras, the facing particles in the particle system would face towards that active camera during the render, and this always ensured that obviously the particles were facing the camera. With particle flow, you don't actually have that anymore. You have this button here, and you can click on it and you can choose a node, and you can see that when you choose a node you get the name of the node there. Now, as an example, I can actually click on this light over here, and now the lights will actually face towards that light. So you can see we actually update the timeline, and you can see the particles are now facing towards the light. If I grab the light and move it around, you can see the particles keep their orientation to the light. So you lose this automatic ability for the particles to change their target during a sequence, but you do gain the ability to actually have the particles face towards any target, not just the active camera. So swings and roundabouts there. So I'll just set it back to face towards the actual camera that we've got here. Do a quick scrub so it updates. And you can see the same thing. If I move the camera around, you can see we get this updating of all the particles. Now, the second thing that you may notice is that all the particles are facing directly towards the camera. So effectively there's a line being drawn between the particle, let's say the particle center here, directly towards the camera. And one of the options you can see here